Okay, this is going to be a ramble for real, but I just have a few ideas that I'm going through, and I'm trying to conceptualize different ways to sort of cluster ideas. And I think at this stage of field work, what is happening is you have all of these sort of individual gems, all of these individual moments of these like frissions, these lightning bolts come through, and and they end up having like ganglia that attach to a number of other ideas. And so the work of sifting through all of these individual things is to find correlative themes, something substantive that can help foundation it all. So I'm playing with different ideas of um, how to cluster these ideas, or like how to nest them in different idea baskets. And so today I want to think a little bit about this idea of the folk, and who the folk might be, and what the folk might be, and if the folk still exists and how it's being used. So I think that the idea of folk is sort of relegated sometimes in a derogatory term, in a derogatory sense sometimes, also like the term gypsy, where it's referring to a different period of time. It's highly romantic. It homogenizes different kinds of lifestyles into one sort of peasantry. It kind of it sort of makes certain human lives mythological. And it also sort of, I think, is relegated to this idea that it no longer exists. And so it's part of like the free terrain in regard to like creative property. So certainly there's been inklings of work that is being done with claiming motifs, artistic motifs, design aesthetics, certain dances, certain songs from various cultural groups that have had their work appropriated by other institutions of power, other groups of power, who have just taken them as being free reign. So there is certainly some of that going on, I think, in Europe. But in particular, there's less of it, I would say, than, say, a Western power like the United States appropriating, Aboriginal art in Australia or something like that. So there's a different kind of tone, I think, going on at this moment here. And so there are a few things I'm thinking about in regard to this idea of the folk. One is this notion of appropriation and who has accessibility. This is something I've discussed with one of my mentors at UMich and her work in Hungary. And for example, or something I've just been thinking about, you start seeing, Provençal textiles everywhere. This idea of whatever Provençal textiles are, when you're looking for, it's like everybody's pregnant when you're pregnant, is this idea of like these heritage fabrics, and that they index this purity of the folk. And I think that there is this notion, because it's a myth in a lot of ways, that the folk is like the essential zeitgeist of the 18th, 19th, early 20th century village, right? It's the people. It's like the culture of the people. And for example, even going to like the Pyrenean Museum here, within a radius of 50 miles, they have folk costume from, the last century. And every single garment is entirely different, right? So that adds to the idea of this like notion of heritage and locality and identity that's embedded in these things. But I think then, as it gets onto this larger scale, we lose some of that differentiation, and it just becomes like a generalized notion of the people, the folk people, separate from the royalty or the elite system. So anyway, back to this. So I have had discussions with my mentor about this idea of European designers, American designers, Western designers using motifs that are part of these like Western textiles, these folk textiles, within their work, as if it's outmoded, as if there aren't any artisans who are still involved with these motifs to take claim of this heritage, or not, or to at least be involved in the heritage in some way. But I mean, as a maker, it's quite evident that in most of these, I would almost venture to say, within every part of the world, you can find stories and heritages being passed down, and more often than not, you can find artisans who are still involved in some kind of part of this like folk aesthetic, who would be really important to talk to, or people who are reviving it, you know? Anyway, so there's a discrepancy between that. But the thing that I'm most interested in, aside from just this notion of like relegating the folk to the past and the different ways that it's being romanticized and commodified in contemporary spaces, and who might be left out of that, because there is certainly a class divide in this, between, again, like in my mentor's work, for example, design studios who are sort of commodifying certain motifs, and artisans who are still involved in those motifs in regard to their own embroidery in their sort of lower class communities. So I think that's kind of a classic thing. But one of the things I'm most interested in at this point is how the global South is involved in this, particularly in Europe. And when I'm thinking about who the folk are, again, there's like a myth of, or there's some kind of homogenized idea about a peasantry, and about like a working class peasantry, farm peasantry, and a craftsperson peasantry. And that is not something that's only, that type of lifestyle is not only relegated, of course, to Europe, right? And so there is an interesting thing that is occurring in regard to those who can labor in that fashion, those who can labor at that essentially much lower class, working class, sort of forced to labor in a certain way class internationally in regard to these textiles as well. And so I will bracket the history of les Indiens, which is a kind of textile that I'm hoping to specialize in southern France. This is very reminiscent of, from a contemporary company. Again, this is from H&M. And a whole history in regard to French Orientalism and trade and the global South, going back to 1650 in this. So that'll be another video, hopefully. But contemporarily, this idea of like erasing the folk and what that means in regard to a lifestyle, what that means in regard to having sort of a early industrialization, or a different relationship to time and labor, so that you could make certain kinds of textiles because you had in some capacity the time built into your lifestyle in order to do this. There's an interesting disconnect between, again, commodifying these stylistic sort of tropes into contemporary fabrics, and then who was making these. So for example, this shirt's made in Indonesia. And by all intents and purposes, the lifestyle that I would imagine is enjoyed by those who are making this type of garment could very much be considered folk, right? These are not independent business owners. These are people who are involved in an industry that has very much possessed and taken command of certain landscapes. There is pressure from scarcity, limited resource within a lot of these areas to learn certain skills and to work in certain kinds of industries. So it sounds a lot like post-Fordist, even Fordist, sort of peasant culture, and before. So, but there is no ownership from these businesses of the way that they are romanticizing and then in some capacity inflicting certain kinds of lifestyles on others through aesthetics of a certain choice. So again, it's just a little snippet. There's more to it that's super rambly. That's not, I didn't think of this clearly. I just wanted to sit down and have a little rap. And there'll be more in regard to that concept of like the invisible labor, the invisible human within certain designs and what the semiotics of these certain designs entail in regard to romanticizing the integrity and the industry of certain socioeconomic groups and at this point certain cultural groups. So let's just think about that for a while.